So, Satisfactory, a game about factory building. Surely something I'm going to be interested in, right? Well, not necessarily. I bought it some time ago, played it for an hour or two, and all it made me want to do was play Factorio. So that's what I did. I put the game down and made a whole load of time lapses instead. But recently, Factorio has been wearing on me a bit. It is no surprise I've played little else this past year, and I'm ready for something new, and Satisfactory is it. Hello, I'm Bigfoot, and today I'm asking myself the absolutely crucial question of whether I should play more of this game. Let's get into it. In this game, we are pioneers. We are here to explore and to donate resources to our home planet because they seem to be in some kind of trouble. It isn't ever explicitly explained, but we get periodic messages from Earth suggesting that bad stuff is happening. So we have to build a factory that can collect, process, and send these resources back to Earth. It is a really simple premise. Our progress through the game is governed by these gift packages, and this is our prime motivation for building more factory. I am curious what happens at the end. Do we just continue sacrificing these resources to the gods indefinitely? Surely there must be some kind of end to this where no more factory units can be unlocked and we are donating this stuff for no real benefit. I guess we'll worry about that when we get there. And it's going to take a long time to get there. As of writing this script, I'm about 300 hours in. I've attempted 2 real bona fide factories, one of which I abandoned and one of which is still ongoing, and I am no real closer to discovering the end of the technology tree. It is a big game and there is lots to build. And it isn't all about building either. There is a lot to explore here. The map is absolutely massive, and there are a lot of things that need to be collected along the way if we are to reach the promised land of no further game progression. There are creatures, both benign and confrontational, and look, I've seen the game reviews, I know how this goes. I go through the whole basics of the game while I play through it, and thus an argument is made of whether the game is good or not. But the beginning of this game is tortuous. I've done it twice now, and both times I only felt like I'd arrived when I got the jetpack. I'm not interested in the start of the game. That is the part I want to skip over as quickly as possible. What I'm interested in is design. How do I take the base game elements and arrange them in such a way that I can build a factory without having to knock it down or change it at some point in the future, whilst also exploring, learning and developing my skills in the game? It's a difficult one. How to go about building a factory without knowing all the recipes and ingredients that you're going to face in the future. But that is my goal. And for this particular game, there is another facet to consider. We are in 3 dimensions. We can build up as well as sideways. And to do so, we are going to need a building to put the factory in. And this is where I'm slightly better suited to this game. I haven't talked a lot about myself in any of my YouTube videos. I'm not a huge fan of putting my personal details out there. I'm quite a private person at heart. But my day job is to design buildings. I am a structural engineer. So what we have here is a factory building game where we need to build a factory and a building at the same time, both of which I have a fair amount of experience in. It's fair to say that once this game hooked me in, it was difficult to put down. So, design. Here we have factory number 1. It isn't very sophisticated or big. This is just an exercise in trying things out. How to arrange stuff. How to jam this stuff close together whilst maintaining some kind of elegance in the design. We have the hub, elevator and biomass setup up here, and then we have the start of what I thought would be the main factory down here. It seems to start off quite regular and arranged, but then when we move around the corner things start to get a bit messy. This is not Picasso. This is an idiot working things out the hard way. Here is factory number 2, and here I've discovered the vertical conveyor belts and I'm trying those out. This one feels better planned out, but it is definitely smaller than the last one. Maybe I've had some bright spark of inspiration whilst building this, and I'm ready to put it down sooner because I really want to try out this new idea. And here is number 3, and yep, that is probably what has happened. Here I'm clearly trying to get a bus of conveyor belts going, and I'm trying to make it work vertically. So we have the inputs coming through the middle, feeding the factory units either side. And the factory units are starting to have a structure to their placement. I'm starting to find patterns. This isn't actually looking too bad, but clearly this vertical bus idea needs work, so this factory gets torn down like the last ones, and we start again. So now we have some clear structure with factory number 4. I have set aside specific bays for each of the manufacturing processes, and these are feeding and being fed by a H-shaped network of conveyor belts, all moving the correct materials to the correct places. In essence, the bays are carefully and geometrically arranged, and any chaos that needs to occur to make this elegance happen is done in this giant conveyor zone. I've also put a path down the middle of this zone. Access is really important in this game. If I can't get access to a part of the factory and have clear line of sight to the thing I want to meddle with, then I can't meddle with it. So along with this idea for a vertical conveyor bus network, I also need to factor in a walkway so that I have access to these conveyors. I also came to another conclusion. The factory needs to be bigger. If the factory is small, then at each level I'm going to have lots of different processes all competing for space in this tiny H zone. If I only have a few processes on each level, then these can join together and shift up a level. Because the resources are the same, there is less management to be done in the bus zone, and thus there is less competition for space, so a bigger factory is needed. That is not something I have a problem with. Now, because I had built this factory to such an extent, I didn't think it was worthwhile tearing it down and starting again, so I went on a big search for some flat areas of terrain, and where I ended up was in the deserts of the northeast, where I set up this beast in factory number 5. We have coal power stations down here. I wanted to set the factory up right next to the water for this reason, although this didn't end up being enough power. I'm still learning. So on the other side of the desert, which you can't see, are more coal power stations. The structure itself is pretty impressive to look at. I was trying to build everything under one roof, so when I unlocked a new process, I just made a new floor and put the processes there. You can see a couple of mines on the ground floor, and this ended up being a bit of an issue. The new position of the factory that I wanted to use next to the water happened to have a few ore deposits dotted around the place. I didn't want to sacrifice them, so I incorporated them to the ground floor of the structure. The building levels, as a result, are all over the place, and I get lost running around it all the time. Because there was no real strategy around where the processes got placed in the factory, I just unlocked it and put it in the first place that came to mind. It is almost impossible to find the resource you are looking for. Want some reinforced iron plate? Good luck finding it in this mess. I have spent a lot of time searching for the thing I need in this factory. It is impressive, but it is chaos. But before I start again for the final time in this story, it is important to note the things I learned whilst building this thing. To start with trains. I'm not a huge fan of having factory processes dotted all around the place. I want to bring the resources into one main factory and process them there. But I also don't want to pump a whole lot of liquid halfway across the map, up and down hills. That sounds like a complete nightmare. And we have trains. I absolutely need to have at least a train in my factory. So oil comes in on a train. That is the design strategy. I spent a lot of time on this thing, not really knowing what I was doing and all. So here is a train ride. In the place where I decided to put my factory, there are a lot of sand dunes and hills, and to get to where the oil is, I need to venture down a steep valley and over water. So I wanted to come up with a system for adjusting the heights of railway segments across this variable terrain, and that is where this monorail kind of portal comes in. If I need to raise or lower it, I can add or remove a column section from below, and I can therefore maintain some kind of consistent path. This is cool. I like this. I'm going to do more of this. It has occurred to me that these portals would be perfect to mount a hypertube system on. I haven't explored this idea yet. Because my factory is basically all in one place, it isn't spread out around the map, I haven't really found a reason to explore hypertubes. I definitely will, it just hasn't happened yet. When it comes to the train station at the end, I had a clear idea in my head of what I wanted to achieve. I tried to build that clear idea, and what I came up with is this. I have a lot of mixed feelings about this. Sometimes I like it. Sometimes I think it looks like the entrance to a roller coaster at a theme park. It is what it is. It is worth keeping, if only so that I can come back and look at it and try and improve next time I build a train station. Overall, I was happy with the basic factory, and it was only when something in the design broke that I started to rethink things. See, I thought the vertical conveyor belts would go on forever. They don't. It turns out that 5 or 6 floors is about all they are capable of, and the moment I had a single one reach this limit, the whole design strategy came tumbling down. If you have designed your factory around a single fact, and that fact turns out to be wrong, then the factory is wrong. This is the moment the factory broke for me, but there were other moments where I got close. Aluminium. For Satisfactory, this is a complicated process, but for someone who is familiar with Factorio and Angel and Bob, the process is really just a minor inconvenience. Until that is, I realise that the game hasn't really provided me with the tools to solve the problem they have set me. Okay, so processing Morsite requires water, but you get some of that water back as an excess product at a later stage of the process, so we need to regulate the flow of water into the system to prevent it from backing up and stopping. And we can achieve this kind of with a valve where we can set the flow limit to what we want, and this will maintain some kind of precarious balance. And this will work right up until the moment the upward chain of factory processes stops because we aren't using the aluminium, and at that moment the valves are still pumping water into the system, but it isn't being used, so there is a huge overflow. Now, I am all for utilising excess products for useful purposes. I will spend a lot of time working out the inputs and outputs of a system so that it is in perfect mathematical balance. I get a kick out of working this stuff out. And this is what I've done for oil. Here is my oil set up for this factory. The excess products are pumped straight up into another room to be converted into fuel. I spent a lot of time building this. I know that there are further processes for this waste oil down the line, and I wanted a dedicated space for it when I got there. I like excess products. But water isn't an excess product that can be turned into anything useful. If you have a system that is overflowing water, and the game doesn't allow you to pump that water into a lake or a void of some sort, then you are forced to construct a process that serves no benefit to the rest of the factory purely to rid the system of it. The Satisfactory community seems to suggest turning it into concrete and then awesome sinking it, which is just a really crap solution. I think I've resolved to download a mod that auto flushes the system just to deal with this issue. I'm not going to use it for anything other than water. I still like the idea of harnessing excess products, but not for water in this particular situation. Edit. I have spent a lot of time playing this game, mainly because it has been really fun, but also because I wanted to make this video. This script is being written at the same time, and I am learning more as I go. In writing the script, it occurred to me that I don't need to use this wastewater on a process that isn't critical to the factory if I use it on a process that is critical. So the wastewater from aluminium now gets used to make more aluminium. I have a couple of refineries that only use the wastewater, and they are fed by a smart splitter that outputs to these units as a priority. So if there is wastewater in the system, then that gets used first. If there isn't, then the aluminium goes to a refinery that is being fed by a water pump. Effectively two different processes, one for wastewater and one with pure full water input. I didn't think this solution would work so well, but after 20 to 30 hours of it running, I haven't had to intervene once. Edit over. There is a similar issue with silica, where we have access to smart splitters but not smart mergers. I think I know how I'm going to solve this, but I haven't tried it yet, so I'm not going to go into too many details. It might not work for all I know. Edit. It did work really well. What I'm trying to get at is that the game is awkward, almost intentionally so. There are times where I feel like the developers are making things difficult for the player, not because it makes sense, but because they simply want it to be difficult. Blueprints, for example. We can build blueprints in this blueprint designer, but only for a limited size, and that limitation is tiny. It is almost impossible to arrange a single factory process that fits inside it. All the factory units are just so big. For things like my railway portal, it was perfect, but only just. That portal is 4 tiles wide, and that is the limit for blueprints. So that portal is as wide as can be saved with a blueprint. For a game that is so big, this makes them a whole lot less useful than they could be. They should be at least double the size. I have a lot of minor gripes about the game. It is by no means perfect, and those imperfections aren't there unintentionally. As I said, it feels like some problems are there on purpose. The thing is though, the end product is compelling. Having constructed this huge mess of a factory, been broken by the vertical conveyors issue and the aluminium and the water issues, it did not make me want to quit. It made me want to build a new and better one. Awkward, yes, unquestionably, but that just makes the final product of a finely arranged factory that much more alluring. The next one is going to be better. Everything is going to be perfect in the next one. So that is what I set out to do, and here we are. Firstly, the main bus thoroughfare, which is more or less what it is now, a thoroughfare, is wider, with a dedicated pair of routes along the middle, separated from the inter-process mixing that needs to happen. So down the middle are the main ore inputs. Wherever ore enters the factory, it travels along these lines to get to the factory process that needs it. From there, they travel around the outer routes to get to the other processes. If we go back to the previous version, I had this cluster of conveyors that I needed to get the aluminium setup I was just complaining about, and although there is just enough room to manage them in this tight space, the end result didn't leave any further space for future expansion. This new factory with the ore inputs travelling down the middle seems to provide a lot more space than I need. I don't think I'll have any trouble expanding into new recipes or technologies. Secondly, all under one roof didn't work, so now I want separate buildings for similar processes all linked by these bus thoroughfares. I could squeeze them all together if I wanted to pursue the all under one roof philosophy from before, but I have an idea about the general architecture of the finished structure that I want to pursue, and I think spacing it out will make it more elegant when I get there. If we look on a map of the factory, then we can see these individual blocks much easier. This map is from a fan website, by the way, where you can upload your game file and it will show you a map of your factory. This image is not from the game. It really should be. The ability to see your factory on the in-game map should be part of the game. I don't understand why it isn't. So these two blocks are coal powered stations. This time they aren't on the other side of the desert, they are right here where I can keep an eye on them. Then we have the iron and steel block. So anything that only requires iron or steel, or I suppose concrete, is built in this block. Mostly everything in this block I have calculated. Then we have copper and all the processes that involve copper, at least at lower levels of the building. At higher levels we have the more advanced processes. This block is the centre. Anything complicated gets built here. Anything that can be separated from iron and copper will go somewhere else. Like oil, which is here. Again, I have the oil byproduct pumped straight up into another room for processing into fuel. Plastic and rubber are transported down this 3-tile thoroughfare to the rest of the factory. As before, the oil is delivered into the factory on a train, but for this factory I have the train coming in a lot higher. In the last factory I put the train on the ground floor and pumped everything up from there, but it meant that the train station was buried in the bowels of the factory. Cool, maybe, but less than ideal from an architectural perspective. I wanted to make the train station a feature of the final finished structure, but because it was so low in the factory, it would have made the final structure inelegant. This is all in my head, by the way. I'll finish the building when I finish the factory. I have some ideas about how I'm going to build a facade around the structure I've built, but I don't want to spend any time doing it until I know the factory is right. All I know is that once I built the train station in the last factory, and then all the refineries around it, and the walls and conveyors and everything else, I knew I had cocked up. So for this one, I built a whole load of fluid tanks to store the oil at ground floor and put the train station on top of that. The tanks are useful to make sure there is always enough material for the factory to work with. It is useful to have them beneath the train for fluid pumping reasons, and also now the train station is where I want it. A lot of good reasons, and still cool, in my opinion. Aluminium, which is now fixed in this factory, no further complaints, is over here. I think I've overdone it a little. This is probably more aluminium than I'm going to need. I'm still learning. But that isn't necessarily a problem to worry about. Sulfuric acid and batteries are here. I've done the same thing with the excess water from batteries as I did with the aluminium, i.e. I have two separate processes, one which deals with the excess and one which deals with the pure flow, linked by a smart splitter that outputs the excess factory process as a priority. This is my go-to solution now. I haven't had to intervene once on any of these excess factory processes. This dual flow solution is excellent. In terms of the factory itself, I'm really happy with it. I haven't had many problems managing the conveyor belts in these thoroughfare zones. That solution works really well. There is a lot of ore being fed into the factory, and I've managed to achieve that mostly quite elegantly. The factory has been able to cope really well with new additions, new blocks and new recipes. I've even squeezed in a factory line that constructs guided ammunition just because I wanted to see if I could. And I could, without too much problem to be honest. The structure itself is incredibly robust in accepting a wide range of processes in a similarly sized footprint at each level, and that should give me a final structure which resembles a building that could exist in the real world. I am a structural engineer after all. It would be wrong of me to construct something that defies physics in an obvious way. The final structure has to make sense. I think I can come up with something that makes sense of this. Now on to power, and power is the limiting factor in this game, in my opinion. If our driving force is in gathering, processing and donating resources to the gods, then the thing holding us back is power. When I started this factory, I built 32 coal power stations to give me 2.4 gigawatts of power, and this was enough to get me started, but pretty soon I found I needed more, so I built another 32. This was a lot of power and it took me a long way, but at some point my factory exceeded this. I wasn't about to start building more coal power. They are really hard work for not much gain, and I knew that at some point nuclear power would crop up, so I set the factory to idle and cracked on. Up until then I was burning the expensive components in the awesome sink so that I could get the tickets, but at the point I exceeded my power, all of this had to be dismantled. At the point of writing this script, my factory power requirements are about 3 times that 4.8 gigawatts allowance I had with coal, and I'm only just getting to nuclear power. It has been a really long wait. But that long wait has given me time to prepare, to do my research. I know nuclear waste is a problem, and I don't want to have to worry about storing it somewhere. I want a wasteless system. That was the goal, so I did the maths. A plutonium reactor requires 0.1 rods a minute. 0.1 rods a minute requires 20 waste per minute, and a single uranium reactor produces 10 waste per minute. So for each plutonium reactor, I need 2 uranium reactors, and all the waste is gone. A plutonium reactor produces 1 waste per minute, which will just feed into the rest of the system and give me slightly more plutonium fuel rods than I need. Or so I thought. Turns out, plutonium waste is different from uranium waste and cannot be processed into anything else. My research and preparation had failed, but I still wanted my wasteless system. So I went to bed and slept on it, and what I concluded was that the plutonium reactors are a red herring. They don't serve a purpose. They are an aggravation. They provide the exact same amount of power as a uranium reactor, but they give us waste that can't be processed. The developers have put it into the game to be annoying. The way to get a wasteless system is to only have uranium reactors, and then to process the uranium waste into pretty much any of the plutonium processes, and then awesome sync that. I had already constructed the infrastructure of making plutonium fuel rods, so for this factory I'm just awesome syncing those. Bingo bango, wasteless system. I've kept a really close eye on this setup. This power needs to be 100% consistent for the rest of the factory to work, and it does work really well. Everything seems to get processed at the required rate. Happy days. So now I've unlocked all the tiers in the technology tree, and I have all the power I think I will need. It is just a case of building the last few factory processes, linking that to the space elevator, which I need to find some space for somewhere, not obvious as of writing, and then waiting for all of those juicy resources to accumulate so that I can make the last donation to the gods and finally reach the moment of no further game progression. And while that is happening, I can start to build a facade around this thing and make it look pretty. Well, as pretty as my creative talents and the base game elements will allow. This will be my first go at a facade in the game. It won't be perfect. It is likely I have to do things I won't like that will bug me, but that I would learn from and know not to do next time around. Wait, what? Hold on a second. I need how much copper to make nuclear pasta? 1,200 ingots each? That can't be right. No, 1,200 it is. Okay then. Add to the list an entirely new block with at least 40 damn smelters in it. Screw you developers. Okay, so while all of that is going on, I think it's finally time to reach a conclusion and render judgments. So what do I like about the game? There is a lot. I like the scale of the game. The factory units are huge and imposing, and being able to build these massive structures that you can then run around is awesome. There is a huge sense of achievement. Progress can be really slow, but when the end result runs just the way you wanted it to and does just what you designed it to, it's incredibly pleasing. The map is huge and will allow a lot of different playstyles and strategies, designs, you name it. I like the pipes. They are really easy to lay down, and the tools you are given allow an incredible amount of freedom to do what you want, whilst also allowing a lot of accuracy and precision. If I had a picture in my head of what I wanted to achieve, no matter how ambitious, I was mostly able to achieve it. I like the fluid dynamics. The way fluids behave in the game are incredibly consistent with real life. When I started playing with the pipes, I expected to be able to manipulate the flows in some way. I expected there to be an inconsistency somewhere. But what I've actually found is that they manipulate me. A couple of times I've built a fluid system that I thought would work perfectly fine, and it didn't. Every time that I investigated these issues, the problem was my lack of appreciation for the accuracy of the fluid dynamics in the game. For a part that very few people are going to pay attention to or to appreciate fully, a lot of thought has been put into this. I like this. This is excellent. I'd really like to know whether they assumed frictionless pipes, but this is more because I'm a nerd and I'm interested how far down the rabbit hole they went, rather than because I think it would change the way I design a factory. I like the conveyor belts, but I always like conveyor belts. It wouldn't be a factory game without them. The negatives, they aren't big. I don't want to end this review with a whole list of negatives, because the game is fundamentally strong in a lot of areas. It has been incredibly fun to play, but the awkwardness is there. It is difficult to explain. Let me give you an example and see if that helps. During the course of my career, I have used a lot of obscure pieces of design software. These are niche products and aren't designed for a wide audience, so they come with not necessarily bugs, but you have to do things in a particular order to get the software to understand what you're trying to do. It isn't helped by the fact that you have to pay for technical support, so the software companies are kind of incentivized to make their products difficult to use, but that's probably a separate issue. The point is that you can't just sit down and build a model. You have to construct it in the way the computer wants you to. Something could be 0.01 millimeters out of position, and the whole model would fail to run as a result. So I would go through these elaborate procedures to make sure that the exact right node position was set up, clicking through all sorts of menus and submenus. There were methods and user interfaces in the software specifically designed to enter these node positions, but they never seemed to be accurate enough. Putting in a new column should have been 2 or 3 clicks, but it ended up being a whole lot more just because the software was awkward or unfinished or whatever. There are a lot of times where I felt the exact same thing playing this game. Something that could and maybe should have been a few clicks ended up being a whole procedure. It just felt like some of the mechanism for building the game were lacking. There were some things I wanted but weren't there. There were some building methods that should have worked but didn't. There were some factory processes that were just difficult for difficult's sake. Just general awkwardness. Now there is an argument to say that the game is early access and therefore not completely finished. And this does have some merits. But there's also an argument to say that some developers use the early access tag as a shield to avoid very real criticism. I'm a product of the 90s gaming scene, so game cartridges with no updates. For me, the game is the game. Version 7, it should be finished. And that feels like a lot of negatives. But it's really important to remember that absolutely none of this caused me to stop playing. The good outweighs the bad by quite some margin. This is a fundamentally strong game with a lot of positives. It's just that it is occasionally incredibly frustrating and awkward. To finish, I'm going to go through my favourite item. This is what we in the profession call a base plate, or if you're connected to a wall or other column, an end plate. In the real world, these are used to connect a column or beam to a base, wall or other column or beam. And that is what they do in the game, but for absolutely no end purpose whatsoever. These items are purely aesthetic. Now you could argue that the columns that sit on them are purely aesthetical also. They don't hold the structure up like they would in the real world, but I found a very real use for them for my train portal. They aren't just aesthetical to me, they serve the genuine purpose. These base plates do not. What these base plates tell me is that some thought was put into the game regarding the structure. In the real world, you wouldn't build a 5 or 6 story building and fill it with really heavy factory units. The structural engineering required would be prohibitively expensive. What you would do instead is put all the really heavy stuff at the bottom and sit it on the ground, and that way we don't need to design the structure to support it. We can design the rest of the structure to support the lighter stuff, like offices and such. But if money were no issue, and you had practically unlimited resources to achieve it, you could build this kind of factory, if you wanted, but you would need some freaking ginormous columns. And lo and behold, that is what the game gives us, 2 meter wide columns. That is probably in the right ballpark for what is required to build a factory like this. And if you needed that size columns, you would need the holy mother of all base plates. That is why this is my favourite item. It serves no purpose other than to tell me, the structural engineer, that the real world was at least considered. I'm assuming here that gravity is the same on Earth, and that isn't necessarily the case. I'm definitely overthinking this now. If I discovered these things earlier and knew exactly what I was doing in the game, then I would have built my whole factory around using this one item. In fact, that is probably what I'm going to do next time around. So, should I play more Satisfactory? If it isn't obvious already, then hell yes, I'm going to be playing more. What a wonderfully awkward but awesome, little but huge game.